May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Thank you to each and every child and teen who participated in this year's pageant production, and for all the parents behind the scenes. Your retelling of this sacred story is a powerful witness to the ways this narrative will be continued to be retold in every language and medium, in circumstances joyful and sorrowful, from generation to generation. Thank you. Perhaps because this year's pageant was shorter than I'm used to, or perhaps because this has been a year marked by absences of all kinds, I noticed the parts of the story that we often leave out of our various pageants. Mary, for instance, gets to fast forward from learning about her miraculous conception right to the night of the birth of her child. We get to skip over her morning sickness, the slow ballooning of her belly, the twinges in her back. The wise men, too, jump from their Far East home to the manger bed in the span of a church aisle. The rest of the story has been lost to time. Thank God. Don't get me wrong. I think it's perfectly all right that we've left out the more boring details. But there is a danger in that. If we aren't careful, we can fool ourselves into thinking that God was only present in the big, memorable moments, the ones worth writing down and reenacting. When we look back on this year, what will we say about this time? Maybe we'll start with that fateful Friday, the 13th in March, when our kids were pulled from school. I know we'll remember the ones we've lost. I hope we'll talk about this week in Advent when the vaccine trucks rolled out all over this country and nurses danced in the streets. I hope we'll name it as the beginning of the end. And I pray that this tale will end with all of us back together with hugs and smiles and communion and so much shared food. And when we tell the story of 2020 in years to come, what will we leave out? Perhaps we'll leave off recounting all those hours spent standing in 6-foot apart lines with our masks, or minutes idling in Zoom waiting rooms, the washing and rewashing of our hands, the long, lonely, isolated days of nothingness. In God's hands, those days and those hours were not wasted. More than any other time of year, Advent calls us to remember that the waiting is holy. The space between spectacular events is sacred, too. One of the greatest ironies of 2020 will always be that the more we all did nothing, the more we all contributed to a greater something, giant global movement to keep one another safe. The more we stayed home, declined invitations, canceled plans, the more we sacrificed for love. Those empty evenings and blank social calendars were not a waste, but a witness to a great collective action to save each other's lives. God was in those moments, all of them. We may not have had the bandwidth to feel gratitude for each moment as they went by. We may not have been able to summon the wherewithal to honor them as precious at the time, but God has. God is treasuring up and pondering all these things in God's heart, just as Mary did. God is in the ordinary and in the moments we forget. In the shuffling of feet and the clinking of keys and brushing of teeth, God acts behind the scenes, shaping us for a greater purpose. Just because we do not remember the quotidian and the humdrum does not mean we are not being profoundly shaped by it. Perhaps you too have known the heartbreak of watching a loved one descend into memory loss and dementia. And if you have, I hope part of you also knows this to be true. Even the things that have been forgotten are still real, still true, still make us who we are. They are still held in God's heart long after they have slipped our minds. So what do we do with the frustrating, the boring, the forgettable moments of 2020? We can bless them, we can thank them, and we can let them go. In doing so, we entrust them to God. We free ourselves to tell our stories the way we'd like, the way that makes them worth retelling. And we can know that we'll never fully grasp the wholeness and the greatness of the story that's still playing out in all our lives. Amen.